America, we got to get back to doing what's expected of us as free citizens in this democracy. That means being tolerant, being respectful, staying informed, and being engaged. I'm former Congressman Joe Walsh. Follow me here and join the millions of Americans who are renewing their social contract with each other. The social contract, it's on us. Hey, former Congressman Joe Walsh with you this Friday. There is almost no issue that I care more about than the state of Israel, what's going on in the Middle East. I think I could probably think of another issue or two that I am as passionate about. My guest today, I know, feels every bit as passionately about the Middle East, Israel, and Gaza as I do. And I want to welcome him, Omar Baddar. Omar, my friend, there you are, sir. Good to see you.
Yep, great to meet you.
Omar is a Palestinian American political analyst. I'll say at the outset, man, that maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. You and I probably almost completely disagree on the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And we met each other on like the Piers Morgan show a few months ago. One of those, stupid shows where you got 15 minutes, 4 people, and you're all kind of yelling at each other. And we weren't necessarily yelling at each other, but it's kind of a food fight. And the topic was Israel. So I just want to say at the outset, Omar and I got to know each other on Piers Morgan. And then Omar, I could be wrong, but almost at exactly the same time after that Piers Morgan interview, you and I kind of privately reached out to each other and said, you know what, man, I liked what you had to say. I'd love to have a conversation with you about this topic.
Yeah.
And I so appreciate you, man, for that. And I apologize because it's taken me this long to do it. And I want to tell everybody listening to Omar and I right now, and by the way, you can follow Omar on Twitter at Omar Baddar, Baddar. He's a great follow. We should always follow people we agree with and disagree with. You and I, man, this is an issue, a topic. We need 5 hours. You and I with a couple beers, sitting down, really talking. We don't have that time. We've got a short amount of time today, and this issue deserves longer. And what I thought I'd do, Omar, is I want, because I really want to get some of your broad thoughts. I'd throw a few broad questions at us and get your and my take. But first, welcome. And for the audience, none of us like labels, but I want you to label yourself. I'll start first on this issue. I am very, very pro-Israel. When people ask you to label yourself on this issue, my friend, how do you label yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious fact that I am Palestinian American. Both of my parents are from Palestine, and so that comes with its own bias, I suppose. But I think of my view on this as being fundamentally grounded in international law and in human rights and in the concept of justice. And that's kind of the angle that I come at this issue from.
Wonderful answer. And I thank you. Let's start with a first question where you and I probably will agree, actually. The knucklehead, the bad guy, the dangerous guy in the White House this week came out with just crazy, stupid nonsense. Oh, I got it. Let's have the United States of America take over and own Gaza. I'm assuming you and I disagree with that, maybe for different reasons. But give me, Omar, let's start our discussion. Your reaction to what Trump said this week.
Yeah. Joe, we do agree on this one. And honestly, part of the reason why I'm excited about this conversation is that even though we come at this from extremely different angles, and I don't think we're going to reach agreement by the end of this conversation, nonetheless, your willingness to have a honest, good faith conversation to me is good enough. That's how you create opportunities for people to understand the issue better, and we can influence our views in some ways. And I think we definitely agree on the fact that Trump is just one of the most dangerous people that you can possibly have in charge of the country on any topic. And on this one in particular, I think even though Trump has said a lot of extreme things and done a lot of extreme things, this by far seems to be the most extreme proposal he has ever put forth. The idea that now it is official policy under his administration that we're going to completely destroy Palestinian society in Gaza. We're going to scatter Palestinians to other parts of the Middle East, and that Trump is going to come and own the Gaza Strip. I mean, it's bonkers. Yeah. And the fact, what makes it even more offensive and distasteful is that he frames it as concern for the Palestinians. No. If, you know, you want a better life, this is the way to do it. And like, what are you talking about? You're directly across from the other podium of the guy, Netanyahu, standing next to him, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court for what he's done to Gaza. And all you have to do is turn to him and say, you have to cut this out. You can't continue destroying Gaza. The reason why Gaza is unlivable is because of what Israel has done to it over the past 15 months. Frankly, even longer than that. But that has been the particular kind of like the more extreme version of Israeli violence in Gaza. And it's just delusional that Trump thinks he's going to come along and just advocate for ethnic cleansing that way, and that the region is going to go with it. The worst part of it, Joe, is that he's a liar. When he says, everybody I talk to in the region says this is great, nobody thinks this is great. Perhaps maybe with the exception of Netanyahu, like that might be a fantasy of his to achieve it, but certainly nobody else in the region.
Well, and Omar, I agree with you. And this, you and I will 100% agree. I don't think most of Israel agrees with what he said, but yes, I don't think Trump gives a damn about Israel. I don't think he gives a damn about the Palestinian people. Trump cares about Trump, and all Trump cares about is, oh, some condos in Gaza that I can make money off of. Yeah, it reeked of clearly ethnic cleansing. It reeked of colonialism. Nobody wants it. And so I'm with you 100% on that, Omar. As someone who right now fundamentally doesn't believe the two-state solution is a possibility, I think that people around Trump, even though he's an idiot and he doesn't care, they'd like to end the whole two-state solution thing, and that's part of what drove him. So let's start, my friend, with this question, and you start again and give me your perspective. And I'll just throw 77 years. We'll go back to 1948, 47, 48. In your mind, big old broad question, why after 77 years, my friend, in your mind, is there absolutely no peace in that region? Here we still are. Why?
So the reason has shifted over time. I think initially the problem came from the fact that there was an effort to create an exclusivist Jewish state on land that was Palestinian. In principle, right, there's nothing wrong. You know, I'm kind of open when it comes to immigration policies. I think countries should be more welcoming and so on. But the idea came that Israel was going to carve out a part of historic Palestine to create a Jewish state. And the UN at some point came in and said, okay, fine, let's divide it. We're going to do 55% of the land to a Jewish state and 45% to an Arab Palestinian state. And you can imagine, if you're a Palestinian at the time, if an immigrant population comes in, obviously on the back of the Holocaust, on the horrors in Europe against the European Jewish community and all that, definitely trauma that is beyond imagination. But then to just say, we're going to give most of your country to this immigrant population to create a new state on top of it, you can imagine from an American perspective, we would not be down for that, right? Even when we say we would like to welcome the people, you know, I don't know what your attitude is about this, but people who are saying we should have more flexible policy on immigration and be refugees and whatever.
Absolutely.
But if somebody came along and said, okay, fine, then let's take California, Texas, and New Mexico and make that a new state that is specifically for the immigrant population, Americans would not be down for that. Nobody wants to give up a part of their country. So that was the trigger of why there was conflict. But when I look at it today and sort of like how these things have changed over time, you ultimately ended up in a situation in which you have one population dominating another. That you have Israelis who enjoy democracy, freedom of movement, freedom of water, access to the outside world, living effectively on top of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories in particular, who have no rights. Palestinians in the West Bank can go from one city to another without Israeli control. Israel decides whatever lands it wants to take, demolishes Palestinian homes, keeps Palestinians in Gaza locked in under siege, where people in Gaza can't trade with the outside world, don't have an airport, don't have a seaport. So that system of domination, I think, is what almost every human rights organization in the world describes as an apartheid system. And I think that's the reason why we have conflict today.
Okay, so to paraphrase, my friend, Omar, you'd say there's fundamentally we still have conflict in the region because the world decided to carve up this land. The Palestinians, the Arabs, and pardon my language, offended by that, pissed off by that. Oh my God, how can you do that? And then over the course of 70 some years, that anger has grown, and then the way they've been treated has just exacerbated that anger, and kind of that's where we are today, just broadly speaking.
Sure. I mean, the only modification I would make to that is I don't think offended just as a symbolic thing.
No.
These are people's lives really on the line. It's your ability to be free in your own country. And so to say that somebody else is going to take half of your country, that has real implications on people's lives. It's not just opposition to somebody being there. I think all of us at this point, certainly majority of Palestinians would be perfectly fine and happy if there was a state in which everybody had equal rights living under the government.
So, and again, there's no time for this. I'm going to give you my thought, and then let's batter it back and forth. When you say carve up your country, I think that's an interesting conversation historically as to what that land was and who controlled and ruled and owned that land and who has ties to that land going back hundreds and thousands of years. But I don't want to get into that because I agree with your fundamental point that the world, the UN, colonialism, then the UN, to solve a problem, said, okay, the Israelis need a homeland. We're going to carve up this piece of land, give some of it to Israel. So we can quibble about the numbers. Some of it to the Palestinians. In essence, in 48, a two-state solution. And so when people ask me now, Joe, what the hell? Why the fuck? Why do we still not have peace? My answer always is the Palestinians are still so aggrieved by what was done 77, 78 years ago. And they've never fully accepted the belief that Israel has a right to exist. And they've spent 77 years fighting back against that. Are you and I, where are we kind of apart on that?
So here's my pushback, right? And this is part of the reason why I said things changed over time.
Yeah.
Is that there did come a time in which Palestinians accepted the de facto reality that Israel is more powerful than they are, that much of the Western world, certainly the ones with all the money and weapons, were supporting Israel at the expense of Palestinians. And Palestinians came to the conclusion that we need to make a compromise. And so the modern two-state solution is based on international law, in which Israel keeps 78%, nearly 80% of historic Palestine. That's Israel as accepted by the UN. And Israel was supposed to withdraw from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Those are occupied Palestinian territories that international law is clear about, that Israel does not belong in those territories.
Omar, do you agree, again, at the beginning, and I can see where you'd say the whole concept of giving Israel a piece of land and carving up this land, that's the original sin. I understand that. I disagree with it, but I understand it. And I understand why Palestinians feel that way. But from that beginning, when 2/3 of the UN said, this is the way it's going to be, two states live in peace, Israel at the beginning accepted it. The Arabs and the Palestinians went to war right away. You'd acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean, I would acknowledge that, yes, Palestinians rejected it and there was a Palestinian uprising against it. And then Israel cracked down on the Palestinian uprising and started depopulating Palestinian towns and villages. And then neighboring Arab countries got involved as well. So the conclusion, I think, I think the atrocities that were committed in 1947, 1948 are worth highlighting. But I agree with the basic framing that it was the Palestinians who rejected a two-state solution in 1947.
You know what? And I've always wanted to ask you, someone like you, who I just fucking respect, go back in time. If you had been there then, and this always fascinates me, and 2/3, and the UN decides, that the world decides, the world's powers decide through the UN, this is how we're going to do it, two states. What would you have rejected it? Would you have advocating rejecting it, or would you have advocating accepting it? And let's figure out how to make this work. What would you have done, Omar?
I mean, if you could foresee what history was going to lead to, if you could see all the death and suffering of Israel.
No.
Yeah.
No, even Omar, pretend you can't foresee.
Yeah.
You are you're
That's
a Palestinian leader back then,
yeah.
and the UN makes this decision after the Ottoman rule, after the British administered the territory. The UN then says, "Okay, here's how we're going to fix it, guys."
Yeah.
Would
No,
you have advocated then?
honestly, that's a very tough one, right?
Oh, I
It's
can imagine.
just, again, I think that there was good reason for Palestinians not to be game for that. The British, who were colonizing Palestine at the time, were not the legitimate rulers. And these kinds of decisions, I think you consult the local population about what should be done. And if you had taken a vote between the river and the sea about what should be done to this land, when Palestinians were an overwhelming majority, obviously there was majority sentiment against the concept of dividing it. And for me, that means something. I believe in democracy and self-determination. And so if that's the majority of people in that land, they don't want to give up half of their country. I think you just have to accept that that's the reality. Now, in retrospect, is different.
Yeah.
Knowing everything that has happened since and looking at this point just at the worst horrors of it
Yeah.
right now, maybe if you could go back in time and say that would have stopped so much horror, that it probably would have been a better thing to have pursued.
And Omar, I know I'm biased as well. All God's children are biased. So again, from my perspective, okay, this decision was made. The UN made the call. Israel accepted it. The Arabs went to war and didn't. And then the history then of the region has been the Palestinians and Arabs continuing to launch wars, and Israel fights back and wins and grabs some more territory because the Arabs started wars and then terrorism, and eventually seeking peace, Israel tries to give land back for peace, and it's just never worked. Do you, Omar, do you fundamentally believe that that there should be a state of Israel?
Willing to accept a state of Israel as a compromise.
Explain that to me, because I find that I want to understand that language.
So let me talk just briefly, because I think that's the most important part. And I think, did you ever, by the way, read Jimmy Carter's book, Peace,
Yes.
Not Apartheid?
Yes.
It's a reading of what happened during the so-called peace process in the 1990s, which to me is kind of like the pivotal point where we came very close to potentially putting this issue behind us. Palestinians, like I said, accepted the fact that they are the weaker party and were willing to reach a compromise. That's when Palestinians agreed to a two-state solution in the 90s. The idea is Israel leaves only 1/5 of historic Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and Israel gets to keep the rest. And it's not that Palestinians are saying Israel was right to drive us out of the other parts that did become Israel as recognized by the UN, but they're saying we're willing to accept that as a compromise. And the entire world was celebrating that peace is around the corner. And what Israel did during the so-called peace process is, instead of withdrawing from the occupied territories, they kept building more and more settlements throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza at the time. Later, they pulled those back. And the outcome was Palestinians understood that there was no sincere effort on the part of Israel to allow even a small Palestinian state to exist. And that's because Israel felt like they don't need to compromise. They have all the power and all the backing. And that is why you have people like Netanyahu at the time kind of implicitly saying it, and at this point very explicitly and openly saying it, that there will never be a Palestinian state. And all they're doing right now is plotting how to get rid of the remaining Palestinians to capture the entire territory.
I've actually found more common ground between us. Mm-hmm. 2 weeks after October 7th, I called for Bibi to resign. I think Bibi's been there way too long. He's corrupt. I think he's now a negative influence on all of this. And I used to be a big fan. And I agree with you, my friend, that when I look back on the last 20 years or so, I think because, and it goes to kind of what you said, this thing was done. The UN did what it did. The state of Israel was created. The Arabs went to war, and then the Arabs launched wars, launched a number of wars, always launched the wars. Israel won the wars and grabbed territory. And eventually, you said it, once the Palestinians realized, okay, those guys are stronger, we're weaker. Okay, now let's sit down and have a two-state solution talk. It got to the point after Israel, I believe, after all of the wars launched against them, and then the years and eras of regular terrorism, where I think the far right in Israel began to have influence and say, fuck this. Look what we've been putting up with for years. They've been attacking us, going to war, committing terrorism. So screw it. Maybe there shouldn't be a two-state solution. So I do agree with you that I think Israel is at a point now where maybe they're thinking, forget about it. I think the Palestinians have always been there. Maybe that's where you and I disagree.
Yeah. I don't want to quibble over too many details, but I don't think I would agree with the description that it's Palestinians always who are launching it. Wars, the 67 war, there's no dispute that Israel fired the first bullet of that war when they attacked Egypt. They said it was a preemptive strike because Egypt had the military buildup. But there is plenty of intelligence analysts who are suggesting that there was no intention on Egypt's part to actually attack, that it was all bluster, and that Israeli leaders suspected it was all bluster, but thought this was a good opportunity. So anyways, I don't want to get to, I don't think that's the important part.
Okay. Omar, and this is why you and I love talking to you. And we're going to have like 13 of these conversations. I would dispute that. Mm-hmm. But would you agree generally that from 48 for at least 30 to 40 years, generally the Arabs and the Palestinians were
rejected
the aggressor?
Israel. I think
were the aggressor.
I would not say the aggressors, but I would say rejected Israel. To me, it's still the fundamental dynamic. It's Israel imposing itself on that territory against the wishes of the local population and driving them out. In 48, 700 to 800,000 Palestinians were driven out from their homes, hundreds of towns and villages destroyed, and Israel said they're not allowed to return. So to me, that's the original act of aggression, if we're going to use the word aggression. But I would concede that that there was Palestinian and Arab rejection of Israel as a motivating factor during that time.
Would you agree that generally over the course of these 77 years, and I'd agree there are people on your side who would justify, as you led with, because the Palestinians feel they've been treated so unjustly. But would you at least agree that because of that and the power dynamic, the Palestinian side has generally initiated more of the violence over the years?
They were the more aggrieved party with something to fight back against. So sure, maybe in a sense, yes. But to me, the point of emphasis is really how that dynamic has shifted drastically in the 1980s. That to me is the part that nobody talks about enough, is when Palestinians reached the point of compromise and said, fine, we'll accept that Israel exists and make an accommodation for a small Palestinian state. The power dynamic is the reverse. Israel is still the more powerful party. The Palestinians are the more aggrieved one. And the more powerful party won't accept any of the compromises and the bending back, the backwards bending the Palestinians are initiating. And that's what Jimmy Carter saw when he said, the fundamental problem is that Israel rules over the occupied Palestinian territories. Those don't belong to Israel. Israel refuses to give them up. And they deprive Palestinians of the most basic human rights. I think Carter's assessment that this was the core problem from the 80s until today is an accurate understanding of what we've experienced over the second half of that full 77 years.
And again, obviously, I disagree with that, but I don't. Again, that would take us down a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down, because I think there is an extreme Israeli element now that has strengthened. But let's be real. Generally, the Palestinian population has been ruled by terrorist organizations who, in their charters, it was the destruction of Israel. Omar. Hit me over the head. Mm-hmm. I think I tweeted this yesterday, 2 days ago. Pick me apart. I said there would be peace tomorrow in the Middle East. Tomorrow. If the Palestinians raised their hands and said, we want peace, if they said no more terrorism, and if they simply said Israel has a right to exist. If the Palestinian side in unison stood up and shouted those three things, there'd be peace tomorrow. Beat me up, my friend.
What's interesting about this is that it's not a theoretical claim. If only we could imagine that were to happen, then would there be peace or not? It's the fact that there is precedent for it. It's the fact that the Palestinian leadership, at the time it was all under the Palestinian Authority, did say we want peace, did crack down on violence, was even praised by Israeli leaders for the extent to which they've gone to suppress any violence against Israel in an effort to create the right conditions for peace. And that Israel's response was, great, we're so glad you're negotiating over peace with us. Let's sit down and talk. But while they were talking, Israel kept expanding settlements. So that belies the claim that Israel was interested in any kind of accommodation. That's the fundamental point. If you want to allow for a Palestinian state to exist, there is doublespeak happening where you're saying that out of your mouth in the 1990s if you're the Israeli government, but on the ground you are systematically destroying Palestinian homes, taking over Palestinian areas in the West Bank that you want for yourself. And that's why that peace process failed. So we've tried that and it has not led anywhere.
And I appreciate the answer. I'd quibble with it, obviously, because I'd say the settlements are just a direct response to, okay, my God, all we do is we give them our neighbors. We're gonna let our neighbors have these pieces of land, and all we're doing is we're getting rockets lobbed at us every day and acts of terrorism every day. Well, screw it. But I hear that. But do you, Omar, this idea? Do you believe if the Palestinian, well, let me back up. Does Hamas need to go?
Hamas, and again, I think I don't want to take that question lightly because I think it's important.
No, that's okay.
I think it's important to remember where Hamas came from. And that's the almost obvious answer for people who want to see Hamas go. They were a small group back in the 80s and the early 90s, had minimal support. When the so-called peace process first launched in the 1990s, in which there was all this hope about a two-state solution, Hamas was against it, and they were trying to sabotage it, and they were carrying out attacks specifically to sabotage it. And yet, there was significant, when you look at the public opinion polls, the majority of Palestinians supported a two-state solution and the negotiations, and they wanted a better future. And it is only when it became clear that Israel had no intention of allowing Palestinians any measure of meaningful dignity and independence that Hamas shot up in popularity, and that became a political force to reckon with.
Then play that out with me, my friend. Again, just one specific example, and we won't focus too long on it. But okay, so then in 2005, Israel says, okay, the heck of it. We're out of Gaza. Every Israeli out of Gaza. I mean, remember the helicopters, they had to pry Israelis out of Gaza. Everybody out of Gaza. Okay, Palestinians, it's yours. And border crossings and port of entries and all that, it's yours. Israel even gave them 3,000 greenhouses. Make this into something. Make this into your state. And then the Palestinian people then put Hamas in charge, and Hamas spends 17, 18 years turning Gaza into a terrorist compound. If you're Israel, what do you think?
Yeah, that to me is, again, a cartoonish kind of accounting of it. I'm not accusing you of kind of like providing it, but it is the dominant narrative. So I understand why that's kind of what people take away from it. But what Israel did is withdraw 8,000 settlers out of the Gaza Strip, expand 12,000 more into the West Bank at the same time, and then just we can focus on Gaza by itself, but just because to me there's a level of unity between Gaza and the West Bank. Like I don't think we can separate those entirely. These are not.
Well, and that's, by the way, I think that's a fundamental flaw that those split pieces of land, I think, are a real problem. But continue.
Yeah, and then even though they emptied Gaza from any Israeli settlers, Israel still controlled the entire perimeter of Gaza, which is why every international organization continued to say that Gaza was occupied by Israel, even though there are no Israelis inside Gaza.
Would you agree there was no blockade from the jump, though? There was no blockade.
There was. It was a lot more relaxed until Hamas got elected.
Would you, again, not to quibble, my friend, would you agree, though, when Israel left Gaza, and even if in your mind it wasn't a perfect departure, and eventually after 2 years, Egypt and Israel, after Hamas, put a blockade on Gaza. But in those beginning days when every Israeli's gone, do you think, again, place yourself back then in 2005, was there a teeny weeny little opportunity there for the Palestinians to make a really cool, prosperous homeland at all?
If you take the Israelis at their word, that what they were trying to do is give a Palestinian state an opportunity to emerge and see how it goes. If you take that as good faith, I definitely don't. If you take that in good faith, then you might see an opportunity. But because I'm familiar with the internal record, where this was a plot from the get-go, this is a way to divide Palestinians and reduce the likelihood of a future Palestinian state emerging and all of that, I don't see that as an opportunity. Palestinians in Gaza were never allowed to have an airport and never allowed to have a seaport. We can talk sometimes about the siege sort of being both Egypt and Israel, and I think that's technically correct. Egypt is blocking its border with Gaza, which it's allowed to.
Sure.
Israel is blocking its border with Gaza. It's allowed to do that. But who's blocking the sea and the air? Israel is the one blocking them. That's why I refer to it as an Israeli blockade and siege. And when you don't allow Gaza to have a relationship with the outside world, simply because they voted the wrong way, voted for Hamas, well, if Palestinians had put Israelis under siege because they voted for Netanyahu and said you're not allowed to have an airport or a seaport anymore and can't trade with the outside world unless you vote the right way, the way we tell you to, nobody would stand for that. Nobody would accept that. And so that's the disparity, is that even though you've had an extremely violent history from the Israeli government and the far right in Israel, we respect Israeli democracy even when it produces these outcomes. But if Palestinians in Gaza vote for Hamas, which again, I'm not a fan of Hamas, but I get that the Palestinian Authority had a reputation of being corrupt and people wanted the people who are really more serious about resisting and working for the people and so on. That's the reputation Hamas has. And that's why they got elected. But Israel immediately clamped down and said, here are the conditions. If you want us to lift the siege, you have to do A, B, and C. Renounce violence, recognize Israel. But Israel did not renounce violence and does not recognize Palestine. So there was a double standard in that entire way, that we're treating one population as dominating another instead of looking at it as two equal sides.
Yeah, I again appreciate the answer. I think from the beginning of this conflict, I hate to keep going way back, I think Israel has always, Israel I'm talking about, maybe not, the certain far right wing in Israel, but Israel and the Israeli government has always accepted the notion of a two-state solution. I don't think from the jump the Palestinians didn't. You could argue that as the Palestinians realized, we're the weak one here. Okay, now we want our piece of land. You could argue that they've changed. I would argue that even before October 7th, Hamas, Hezbollah, I'd even say the PLO, in reality, I don't think they've ever fully forced the Palestinian people, encouraged them to accept that Israel has a right to exist. And I just think, like Omar, that's just like the fundamental obstacle. But that's where you and I probably disagree, because you don't think Israel believes the Palestinians have a right to a state.
Yeah, and it's again, the disparity of power here really matters. When you have one side dominating the other, that's when you can basically show, the Palestinians have no power to decide whether Israel exists or not. Let's be honest, right? Israel exists. It's a reality, the most powerful country in the region. And this is part of why I love Israel, because Israel is an entrepreneurial, successful, prosperous country. They've grown, they're strong, their technology is amazing. Kudos to them. Was there ever an opportunity at all in these 77 years for the other side to say, suck it, we're going to build our strong, That's precisely it. That is precisely it. The disparity of power is so great. Palestinians were never given an opportunity.
Even from the beginning?
Even from the beginning. Really, we are looking at what you have. Have you spent, by the way, any time in the West Bank? I'm just curious if you visited.
Yeah, when I was in Congress, a couple visits.
I mean, people have different license plates. And if you're a Palestinian, you have to stop at a million checkpoints. Everything.
Agree with you.
And
I agree with you then. Yeah, now
a dominated population, and that prevents you from being able to create something.
Omar, my friend, completely agree. Now it's untenable. I agree. I would just argue that situation in the West Bank is a product of all these years before, where Israel said, "Okay, I'm taking in. I got out of Gaza." And all they're doing is firing rockets and committing terrorists against us every day. I don't want the same thing happening from the West Bank. So we're going to have a different model in the West Bank. You and I agree. Well, I don't think the West Bank model works. I agree with that. I just think that it was a reaction from Israel. I don't want to be taken incoming every day from two sides.
Yeah. Question for you. If you think that's the motivation.
Say that again, Omar. I missed the start.
Yeah, if you agree, if you believe that Israel left Gaza in a good faith effort to see how that goes, why did they never for 1 minute throughout the entire peace process from the 1990s through the Gaza withdrawal never ever stop expanding their territory in the West Bank? If there was any possibility of good faith about allowing a Palestinian state to exist, wouldn't you at least hold the settlements and wait to see how things might go?
Yeah, I'd argue again. I've had a number of discussions with Israelis over the years on this topic. They viewed these two pieces of land, and Americans are so uneducated, they probably don't even know what you and I are talking about right now, but the West Bank and Gaza as two distinct issues. Clearly, again, I know there's a tie, but that's how Israel, I think, views it. And we got out down here on our south, we got out of that piece of land. Let's see if the Palestinians will build a country. But at the same time, we've got troubles up here, so we're going to deal with this separately. I get your point that if you're down in Gaza and you're seeing some building the settlements, that might piss you off. But up in the West Bank, but my God, Gaza, you got an opportunity, even if you think Israel's still blockading you or to whatever degree. Come on, man, build something. Instead of spending gazillions over almost 20 years building tunnels.
Let me put it this way.
Go ahead.
On sort of, so you have Gaza under siege.
When?
From the time Hamas got elected, 2006, all the way until now, really. You have.
Well, but who's responsible for that?
Yeah. So let's talk about that.
Go ahead.
The responsible party for me is the party that has imposed the blockade on Gaza to prevent it from having an economy, where 50% of Palestinians in Gaza are unemployed, where food insecurity is through the roof. This is even before October 7th. This is just the status quo in Gaza, where they can't trade with the outside world, and they can't travel unless they get permission from Israel to leave. That's not a tenable situation.
So
Hamas comes along and just
go ahead.
Kind of like think a little bit of sort of why they're perceived a certain way by people living in Gaza. Hamas comes along, and the question is, whatever little aid of money that you get in, why don't you try to make this cage that you're living in as nice as possible for Palestinians there? And they would argue, no, we're going to use every penny that we get to try to build the infrastructure to fight back so that this is not a cage anymore. Who
decided? Do you think the Palestinian people decided that?
I don't think so. No. I mean, well, Palestinians elected Hamas to begin with. Democracy fell apart fairly quickly. And yeah, Hamas just made the decision on their own.
And this is great, Omar, because this is the dispute in essence. Yeah. I hear what you're saying, that you call it the Gaza siege. And it's so cool to me. It's just interesting that you call it the Gaza siege after Israel left. But I get that. I get what you're saying. But Israel leaves, and almost immediately, like Hamas came along. Hamas came along like almost immediately. Within 2 years, Hamas was elected.
Yeah, less than that even. They got
less than that even
elected, and then the U.S. was putting pressure on the Palestinian Authority to coup Hamas in the West Bank,
right?
To overthrow them, even though they were democratically elected. And that's when Hamas won the civil war effectively. And
from the jump, Hamas, right away after Israel left, in essence, a year and a half, Hamas begins turning it into a terrorist compound.
I don't agree with that.
I know you don't. But then so from my perspective, then, and then boom, the acts of terror and the rockets begin every day. So Israel needs to do something to fight back against that. But let's stop there because we only got a couple minutes left. Mm-hmm. By the way, love you, and we're going to continue this. Sure. Give me, and I'll do the same now, or go back 77 years. Give me one major criticism of your side in this dispute, and I'll do the same.
Yeah. I think criticizing the Palestinian leadership, both in Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, is probably the easiest and thing to do. The Palestinian Authority is corrupt. It does not prioritize the well-being of Palestinians. It is not there for me as a genuine attempt at representing Palestinian aspirations. And they're just happy to play the game, keep themselves rich and powerful and privileged. And you have, and just let this conflict drag on forever. And Hamas, on the other hand, you've got kind of like the other extreme, people who are committed exclusively to a militant path forward, which is not necessarily the best dynamic in that particular situation. and they have extreme views of their own domestically in the way that they rule Palestinians. Neither authority, neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority, is big on allowing for dissent or freedom of expression. So there's no shortage of things that I can criticize on my side. The only thing I would say is ultimately it's the same with almost anything else. Like in South Africa during the apartheid era, the ANC was committing acts of terrorism and blowing up civilians. But the overarching picture was that the system of apartheid was the core problem, and that's what needed to be dismantled. And so I'll just say similarly, even though I can go on forever criticizing things about Palestinians, for me, the fundamental reality is Israel's system of domination over Palestinians, and that is the fundamental reason Palestinians are not a free people, and that's why we have conflict. And for me, that's what we need to be focused on.
And my fundamental criticism of Israel is I do think in recent times, they've basically said, fuck it, we're tired of this. So they've, in essence, given up on the notion of peace. And now I think we have two sides that kind of have. All right, we're going to close this, Omar, with, I'm going to ask you, and stupidly, the stupidest broad question in the world, but it will lead us to another conversation. What, from this day, right today, this day forward, just as succinctly as you can, map out in idiotically broad terms how we get to peace?
I would say, and I know that you're not going to like my answer.
No, I want to hear your answer.
The way we get there is for the U.S. population to put pressure on the U.S. government, looking at the atrocities that are universally condemned by every major human rights organization in the world. There's unanimity at this point about Israel, ranging from war crimes to crimes against humanity to Amnesty International calling it genocide, what Israel is doing in Gaza. To me, the correct response is the U.S. should cut off all military funding for Israel. That will force Israel to reconsider its hubris and arrogance and become a more moral country. And then when that government feels that pressure, we can start moving towards an accommodation in which Palestinians and Israelis can live in peace and safety. In that
I asked the wrong question. And again, for the record, and it's fine. Genocide, apartheid, obviously I disagree with you on all of that, and Amnesty International can go jump and blah, blah, blah. But I asked the wrong question, Omar. I should have asked, I see what your roadmap is, disagree with it, but respect it. What does peace ultimately look like? Like, you open your eyes in 30 years, what does a peaceful Middle East look like? Just tell me what it looks like.
There's what is referred to as the pragmatic solution, which is a two-state solution in which you figure out a way to divide this land and have two people living side by side. Given the fact that that's off the table, I imagine what we're working towards is ultimately a reality in which borders don't count, in which what matters is your basic humanity. And what I would love to really see long-term is a situation in which there are no barriers separating Palestinians and Israelis, that everybody lives in that land with equality and dignity and freedom.
Shut up!
That's the future that I would like to see.
Shut up! Because that's you stole my answer. Omar, see, I'm much more simplistic than you. Yeah. How to get there? I think all the Palestinians, I'm with Golda Meir. If Israel put down their arms tomorrow, Israel would be gone. If the Palestinians put down their arms tomorrow, I think there'd be peace tomorrow. I know you disagree with that, but I do as well. To me, it all should be, in my mind, it should all be Israel. Gaza, I don't believe in a two-state solution. Peace is the West Bank and Gaza are Israel, and that entire country consists of Israelis and Palestinians and Christians and Muslims and everybody living peaceful together. I'd call it Israel. You probably wouldn't.
Yeah, I think that quibbling over the name is going to be the least of our worries. As long as there's equality and not apartheid, I think that's a vision that we can all get behind.
That's kind of cool that in a weird way, and I'm sure it's more complicated than our differences at the end of the rainbow, but that's interesting. Omar Baddar was my guest. Follow him on Twitter at Omar Baddar. Hey, brother, respect the hell out of you.
Thank you so much, Joe. The feeling is mutual. Really appreciate you having this conversation.
We'll continue this, brother. Everybody else, be brave.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow The Social Contract with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been The Social Contract.